just to say it's great to be here. And my perspective is very much coming from the UK. So I know very little about the situation here in Hong Kong, and I'd be very interested to hear how the debates that are going on in the UK may be different or the same as debates here in Hong Kong. I'm going to be dealing with some very challenging, complex and difficult issues. And certainly if you've come expecting some nice, slick, simple answers to profoundly complex and challenging, difficult questions, then I'm afraid you're going to be deeply disappointed, because I don't have any simple, slick answers. But I hope together we can try and wrestle with some of these issues. And I'm also reflecting from the perspective of a Christian believer who's practiced as a clinician for many years in a secular health service, and again trying to work out the interface between faith and belief and public health systems and so on. And I think we also have to remember that many of the issues that I will talk about are relevant not just out there in society, but they're actually relevant in this room. I mean, I know nothing about virtually all of you, but I can guarantee there are many people here who have been personally affected by some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. For instance, if we're talking about reproductive technology, the statistics in the UK are that 1 in 7 couples will have infertility and will not be able to have children without technological help. And so you can guarantee that there are many people here who are affected by infertility, although maybe as a young person you're not aware of this, and this is something you're going to discover later on in your life, and you're going to have to wrestle with the question about how technology should be used. And when it comes to genetic conditions and disability, I'm sure there are many people here who know that you have a family history of some particular genetic condition, and that you may have watched a loved one struggle with issues of genetic illness and so on. So these are not just philosophical, ethical issues, they're deeply personal issues which touch all of us in some way. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that nearly all medical ethical issues start with human pain. They start with people who bleed and suffer and worry and agonize and die. And therefore, we have to recognize the pain. We can't just treat these as abstract philosophical, ethical issues. As you've heard, my clinical background is as a neonatologist, working at a big neonatal intensive care unit at UCL in the centre of London. This was one of the pioneering neonatal units in the world, really, that pioneered techniques for keeping extremely premature babies alive. And over my lifetime, I've cared for many extremely sick and some very, very tiny babies, going right down to weighing 500 grams or less, fitting in the palm of my hand, literally. And out of a normal 40 weeks or 9 months of pregnancy, we care for babies who go down to the limits of viability at 24, 23, 22 weeks of gestation. The youngest baby I cared for, who ever survived, was 21 weeks and 6 days. And we pour a huge amount of technology into caring for these babies. And as the technology advances, we're capable of doing more and more. But then the question comes, just because we can, should we? Is this the right thing to do? Is it right to resuscitate every baby, however premature they are, and try and give them a chance of life? Or is there some point at which we should say, no, it wouldn't be right to attempt to give life to a very premature baby? One of the issues which happen with these extremely premature babies is how do we think of this being? How do we think of this being as a member of the human community, as somebody who is the same as the rest of us? Or do we think of this being more like a potential person, a potential member who hasn't yet arrived? And in fact, this is a matter of considerable philosophical debate about the status of a baby, of an extremely preterm baby. And there certainly are a whole number of philosophers who would argue that this being can't be regarded as a human person, but it would be some kind of non-person, a potential person, and that it's not until a later stage of development, particularly when a baby starts to be aware of its own existence, aware of it being a continuing self. So a very deep question of how we regard these members of the human community who are almost like a liminal case, a case right at the limits of humanity. How do we regard them? That's actually my hand on one of the babies, on the baby unit, just to give an idea of scale. And my particular area of research has been into brain injury in newborn babies and how it can be detected and how it could be treated or prevented. And this is an MRI scan from an extremely premature baby showing bleeding. The white material is blood in the center of the brain. And we're able to predict with a moderate degree of accuracy what the likely consequences of this bleeding would be in terms of the risk of cerebral palsy, difficulty with movement, or learning difficulties and so on. But the question comes, if we're able to detect this kind of brain damage at a very early stage while the baby is still in the intensive care unit, what do we do with that information? Is it ever right to switch off the life support machinery and allow a baby to die? And if so, how do we make those decisions? Who should make those decisions? So I went into this field really because I loved children and because this was a fascinating area of medicine, but I discovered that I was in some kind of ethical maelstrom where these challenging questions of technology and the ability to keep babies alive and were really struggling with it. And that's really where my interest in medical ethics started and how I became increasingly interested in understanding more about the fundamental philosophical, social, clinical, and theological issues. But it gets even more complicated because just one floor away from the neonatal unit is the fetal medicine unit. And here, pregnant women from a wide area of London and the southeast are referred if an abnormality of the unborn baby, the fetus, is detected. And sophisticated technologies used. This is ultrasound, antenatal ultrasound. This is amniocentesis, when the sample of amniotic fluid is taken from around the mother, and the fluid is then analyzed to identify fetal cells. And these are the chromosomes obtained from a very preterm baby, from an unborn baby, a fetus, before birth. And we can see that it's a little girl. She's got 2 X chromosomes down here on the right. But there's an additional chromosome 21 here. And that means that medically this is trisomy 21, and it means that the baby will go on and develop Down syndrome. And in the UK, every time this particular pattern of chromosomes is identified before birth, the mother will be offered an abortion. And because of the way that the law works, in fact, in the UK, it's legal for an abortion to be carried out for medical reasons at any stage of the pregnancy, all the way up until term. And the statistics show that approximately 90%, in 90% of cases where this pattern is found before birth, the mother will choose to have an abortion. And as a result, it's been calculated that there are a large number of missing children with Down syndrome. So these are statistics which are being calculated. The blue line represents the total number of diagnoses of Down syndrome. So it goes from 1990 on the left through to 2006. And you can see there's a steadily increasing rate of diagnoses of Down syndrome. And that is because as the population ages and mothers become older, and because the risk of Down syndrome increases with maternal age, there is a significant rise in the incidence of Down syndrome. But the green line represents the actual number of births of children with Down syndrome. And the discrepancy between the two represents the number of fetuses who were aborted and whose lives were brought to an end, and effectively the missing children who would have been born otherwise. And this has raised all questions. In fact, there's been a campaign in the UK called Don't Screen Us Out, where people with genetic conditions such as Down syndrome have argued that this whole campaign of universal screening, so in the UK, every single pregnancy is offered this kind of screening for Down syndrome and a whole range of other abnormalities. And those people who do have genetic conditions, many of them regard this as some kind of campaign by which the normal majority are trying to wipe out people like me because we don't fit. And we get in the way and we cause difficulties for the authorities and so on. So there has been considerable debate and discussion about this process. But if you think that that's complex and difficult, it's actually about to get a whole lot worse and more complex, and that's because of the development of this technology called free fetal DNA, or now tends to be called non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. So it turns out that in every pregnancy, small quantities of the fetal genetic material are actually circulating in the mother's bloodstream. This seems to be a normal physiological process, but it's now technically possible just by giving a simple blood test to the pregnant mother to isolate the fetal DNA and then effectively to test for particular genetic abnormalities. And at the moment, this is still largely a research procedure, but it is about to come into the NHS in the UK, and I think it's likely to be used in other countries as well. And it's already been shown that it's possible, using this technology, to end up with the entire fetal DNA sequence, the entire fetal genome, just from taking a blood test in a pregnant woman. So fast forward a few years, and you are pregnant, or somebody known to you, your partner or daughter, and everybody's very happy and saying, oh, it's great, I'm looking forward to having the baby. And they say, we just like to do a simple blood test, just check that everything's all right. And then a few days later, you get the result, and they say, well, you're having a little girl, congratulations, but unfortunately, there's some bad news. There's a 40 to 60% chance that she's going to get breast or ovarian cancer before the age of 40 or 50. There's a strongly increased risk of type 2 diabetes, and we're also concerned about early onset Alzheimer's disease. Now, do you think it would be responsible for you to bring this baby into the world? Or do you think it would be better to have an abortion and choose to have another child with a better chance of a healthy life? And so you can just see that ordinary people who've never thought about any of this are suddenly going to be pitchforked into the most complex and challenging ethical dilemmas. And one of the interesting things from a sort of religious perspective is that what previously it was felt that only God himself would know, this kind of information, what disease someone was likely to get 40 years down the line, how they were likely to die, what their risks were of this, that kind of godlike information is now becoming available. But the challenge is that godlike knowledge leads to godlike responsibility. And how are we as mere human beings going to cope with the responsibility of this godlike knowledge? I actually think there is an argument to be made for saying that I don't wish to have genetic screening for any condition for which there isn't any treatment. If you think about what happens in normal life, is that for those of you who parents, you meet your child, your newborn baby, almost like a stranger, a wonderful little stranger, and you fall in love with them because they're just so wonderful and so nice and so cuddly. And then over the next 18 years, you discover all their revolting and unpleasant genetic characteristics. But by then it's too late because you've met them and you've fallen in love with them. And it seems to me, arguably, that's the way around it's supposed to be. You meet your children, you love them, and then you discover all this unpleasant stuff about them. And the interesting thing about genetic screening is it turns this on its head. You learn a great deal about your child before you've actually met them. And I wonder whether that actually changes the relationship and whether actually we are not designed, quotes, to meet our babies as strangers and learn to get to know them. That's perhaps something we could discuss later. When I was a medical student back in prehistory in the 1970s, I remember going to a lecture on how to make a baby. I thought that sounded really interesting. So I went along and I took my notebook. And back in 1970, what I learned was that basically the way you made a baby was that a man and a woman had sexual intercourse, and then 9 months later a baby popped out. So I all wrote it down very carefully in my notebook, although I had actually worked that bit out even in 1970. But if you were to go to a similar lecture in a medical school these days, this is what you would learn. You would learn that you need to have a source of eggs, an egg donor. You need to have a source of sperm. You need to have a uterus, a womb, in which the resulting embryo can be implanted. And then you need to have somebody who's going to care for the baby. And there's absolutely no reason why any of these 4 variables should be related. And so you can see all the permutations and combinations. You can have sperm donation, you can have egg donation, you can have a surrogacy, surrogate pregnancy. And it's perfectly possible to go onto the internet and design a baby just using Google. In fact, you can commission a baby. You can find an egg donor based on genetic characteristics. It's said that in the States it's quite common for women to fund their way through college by donating their eggs, by effectively selling their eggs. There's a commercial market in eggs. And it's interesting that it turns out that eggs also have different commercial value. I wonder if you could guess what kind of eggs, what the characteristics of the donor are that have the greatest commercial value. Well, I'll tell you, but you could probably guess. It helps if you are tall, blonde, musical, athletic, and with postdoctoral education. So if you combine all that, your eggs are really valuable. If you're small, dark, and into chess, I've got bad news for you. And similarly, you can select sperm donors. You can even select sperm on the basis of a celebrity lookalike. So, for instance, this particular donor looks rather like Prince Harry, or whatever celebrity you can choose, and you can select on the donor. So, for me, it's a rather sort of nightmarish vision of the future where all the men look like Prince Harry, and all the women look like Barbie doll with a PhD. And but I mean, I'm joking, but it does show you how this kind of commercialization is actually very ripe, and that reproductive technology, in fact, is one of the very high-earning aspects of medicine now, because people's desperation to have children is such that they're prepared to spend enormous amounts of money. And of course, it offers the possibility of having all kinds of non-standard relationships. So this is Elton John and his gay partner who commissioned a baby using a surrogate pregnancy, using a surrogate mother, and they were able to have children who were genetically related to them. And it's perfectly possible for a single man, for instance, to commission a child, and so-called reproductive tourism is quite common, where embryos are created in rich countries and are then literally ferried across the world to be implanted in the womb of a surrogate mother in a poor country who is desperate to be able to fund her own family and is prepared, therefore, to become a surrogate mother. So it's interesting to see how different cultural forces in our society are melding together in complex and challenging ways. So time and time again we see this in bioethics. Consumerism says, I want to have a child, and I want to have a particular kind of child. I want to have a child who is going to match with my lifestyle, a child who is going to fit with my desires and longings. And then moral relativism says, well, why not? How can we say this is wrong, provided it's safe, provided there are proper legal procedures, provided the correct kind of oversight is carried out? Who are we to say this is wrong? And then technology says, okay, well, we can make it happen. We can work out how to do this. But of course it will cost you. And the cost is not just economic, it's not just financial, it's also often personal and human. There's a human cost behind these technologies which come together. And certainly technology at the beginning of life is moving rapidly and leading to new and very difficult challenges. So using sophisticated genetic technology, it's now possible to take a very early human embryo and directly modify the DNA. And positively, this is leading, this is using this very powerful technology, CRISPR-Cas9, which is an enzyme which has been recently developed, but which allows you to take an entire genome with billions of base pair and to identify one particular base pair and chop out one base pair and splice in a different base pair. So with extraordinary precision. So what was previously science fiction, the idea that one could edit and change the genome, is now becoming possible. So positively, that means that potentially it's possible to take devastatingly severe and horrible genetic conditions, single gene conditions such as sickle cell disease, thalassemia, Huntington's and so on, and edit the embryo at a very early stage and replace it by a normal allele, a variant, and that this would be, therefore would lead to a healthy child. But negatively, exactly the same technology can be used for human enhancement. It could be used to manipulate the DNA of an embryo to create a particular kind of variant which was associated, for instance, with increased intelligence or with athletic ability or the blonde hair or whatever. You may have heard, certainly in the UK, there's been a great deal of debate about so-called three-parent embryos, where this is a treatment for rare mitochondrial disorders, which can be devastatingly severe, and where it involves taking the nuclear DNA and putting it in the cell, into a different cell, so that the child eventually ends up with three parents. So this is already said to have been achieved in the Ukraine, and this also illustrates the fact that this kind of technology is a global phenomenon, and it's perfectly possible for the fact if it's restricted in one part, it's perfectly possible for parents to move around the world seeking technologists and doctors who will provide the kind of treatment. This rather bizarre suggestion has now been made that you don't actually need eggs and sperm to make a baby, and that it's possible using stem cells and modifying them to create babies in the future. And given the fact that infertility is such a problem, maybe something like this will be a way of helping infertile parents to have children. So one of the, I think, important points is that it's absolutely clear that emerging technologies have enormous therapeutic potential, but they always seem to carry with them a potential for manipulation, or what's sometimes called instrumentalization. So that to take a human being and use them as an instrument, as a tool, particularly without their consent, opens up all kinds of ethical concerns and challenges. And so I think one of the interesting things is that although the technology is very new, very often this advanced technology reinforces power structures which are very old. So time and time again we find that with these advanced technologies it is the rich who are using it to manipulate the poor. It is rich countries who are using this technology, and often at the expense of poor countries. It is often males who are using this technology at the expense of women. It is adults who are using this technology at the expense of children. In other words, the power structures so often seem to reinforce existing power structures within society. And the prescient words of C.S. Lewis, who was writing at after the Second World War, he wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, which was extraordinarily prescient thinking about technology and its likely impact. And he said, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. In other words, the goal of achieving mastery over nature so often turns out it's about power structures within society. You may recognize this painting. It's on the roof of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, and it depicts the creation of Adam. And here is God, the creator, and here is the new human being. Well, recently, not so long ago, The Economist magazine had on its cover this diagram. So here is Adam, although it's interesting that in the modern version he has a strategically placed laptop, because for modern sensibilities can't quite cope with the full frontal approach of Michelangelo. But God has disappeared. Now there is no God, there is no creator. In fact, the creative spark is moving in the opposite direction. And this was an article about synthetic life. And within the article, the normally staid economist said, we are as gods, so we might as well get good at it. We have been given these godlike powers of making life, so now we've got to learn how to do it well. So how do we think about this technology and this drive to control? Very interesting words from Michael Sandel, well-known philosopher at Harvard, who says, the problem is not the drift to mechanism, but the drive to mastery. And what the drive to mastery misses and may even destroy is an appreciation of the gifted character of human powers and achievements. So he was arguing really that we need to understand human life as a gift rather than as something that technology again, that rather than as something that is that we control, that we master, that we manipulate to our ends. That's it, thanks. So those are some issues at the beginning of life, and I'm going to come back to that, but I just want to now talk about the other end of life. And in the UK in particular, there's been a whole stream of high-profile public cases, often very tragic cases, which have appeared in the news media, about individuals who wanted to kill themselves. And this was a boy called Daniel James, a very young man, very promising rugby player. He played for the England junior team, and then he was involved in a horrible rugby accident, fractured the cervical spine in his neck, he became paralyzed from the shoulders downwards. He was a very sporty, athletic young man. He became deeply depressed, and he then decided that he wanted to kill himself. His parents tried to talk him out of it. They chivied him along. They brought in some gym equipment. They encouraged him to try and make the most of his life. But then he said to them, if you really love me, you'll help me to kill myself. And eventually they agreed, and they took him to Dignitas Clinic, which is a suicide clinic in Switzerland, where he took a lethal concoction of medicines and died. And at the discussion in the media about this case, which hit the headlines, the general move was very positive. What loving parents, that they didn't put their own needs and wishes first. They did what was best for their child. They helped him to fulfill himself and to choose. It was his own choice to kill himself, and therefore surely it was the best thing would be to help him to kill himself. And why on earth did they have to go to Switzerland? Why couldn't this be available in the UK? And we've had a whole series of tragic cases arguing in favor of the legalization of some kind of assisted suicide. This is the story of Tony Nicholson, who had the rare condition called the locked-in syndrome, which is caused by a stroke at the base of the brain, which has the effect of completely paralyzing someone while they remain fully conscious and alert and aware of what's going on. They're locked inside their own body. In fact, it's thought there are several hundred people in this state in the UK at any one time, but most of them are not trying to kill themselves. Most of them are actually desperately trying to live and to make the most of their very limited situation. If you're interested, there's a wonderful book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which was written by a very prominent journalist in France who was suddenly struck down. He had one of these strokes, and he awoke in hospital with the locked-in syndrome. And he wrote the entire novel, or it's an autobiographical account really. Simply, he dictated every letter by blinking. He managed to communicate by blinking. The title is taken, so the diving bell is his body, in which he feels trapped, but the butterfly is his mind, which is free to fly and to dream and to engage. And there's a very good film with the same title, which really gives you a very good feel for the condition. And in fact, he was desperately trying to live and trying to have relationships with his children, with his wife. Being France, his mistress also turns up, so it also gets very, very complicated around the hospital bed. But Tony Nicholson was different. Tony Nicholson said, "I want to die, I'm fed up with this. And I can't kill myself, I can't do it." So he argued that it was a breach of his human rights. That if he could move his arms and legs, he would have killed himself. But since he was locked in his body, he couldn't kill himself, and it was his right to kill himself and to be killed. And therefore, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the UK as to whether he argued that a doctor should have the right to kill him. And eventually the Supreme Court said, no, we can't agree to this. This is too important a matter for us. This should be for Parliament to make a decision as to whether they wish to legalise this. And so apparently when Tony Nicholson heard the news, he was deeply distressed, and he effectively starved himself to death and died some days later. But the general feeling in the country was, why on earth did this have to happen? Why don't we change the law so that we have some kind of medically assisted suicide for these tragic cases? And in fact, in the UK House of Parliament, in 2015, there was a very high-profile debate about whether or not what was called assisted dying, which was basically medically assisted suicide, should be legalised. But eventually, Parliament argued decisively against the legalisation of suicide, and they said that they felt this was unnecessary. There was much better palliative care was available. In fact, the UK is arguably one of the world leaders in the quality of palliative care that's available, and that it's not necessary to have this kind of, once you have suicide within your society, medically assisted suicide, you're changing the whole relationship with the medical profession and so on. But as you well know, there are many other countries around the world where various kinds of medical killing, assisted suicide is happening. Holland was the first country in the world to legalise mercy killing, euthanasia. And in fact, in Holland, it's now fairly routine for people to be killed by doctors with conditions such as cancer or other terminal conditions. Now, where the debate is in Holland, it's about children. It's about people with psychiatric disorders, such as there have been cases where people have been killed with things like schizophrenia, severe depression, anorexia nervosa, and also early dementia, and even people who are, quotes, tired of life, elderly people who just feel they've had enough and they want to die, but they want to die under medical supervision. They don't want to drift on forever. And so there have been a lot of debates going on in Holland about whether or not to bring in and liberalise the availability of euthanasia, some kind of mercy killing. And one of the issues behind all this is the question of dementia. And it's clear that dementia is replacing cancer as the disease that people fear most. And it's interesting that the statistics show, again, because dementia is an age-related disease, as we have an aging population, we have more and more cases of dementia. And people argue that what are going to be the social consequences? A very prominent philosopher, Mary Warnock, in the UK, came out in public and said she strongly believed that if somebody knew they had dementia and they knew they were going to be a burden to their family or to their carers, that they should have the right to kill themselves. And wouldn't this be an altruistic thing? Wouldn't this be a noble and honourable thing to do, so that you don't want to be a burden to others and you want to have control over your life? So the arguments are varied. It's interesting, the fundamental argument, in the UK anyway, for euthanasia and assisted suicide is really about control. It's about the fact that I have the right to direct my own life. It's what philosophers call autonomy. Autonomos, literally, I make my own laws, I make my own rules, and that I have the right to choose whether I live or die. And for many modern people, it seems frankly outrageous that I can choose every other aspect of my life. I can choose where I work, how I work, what I do, where I live, how I spend my money, who I marry. I can choose everything, except I cannot choose the timing or the manner of my death. And people say, that's ridiculous. Surely this is the 21st century. We should have the right to control the timing and the manner of our death. What's interesting is that if you ask people how they want to die, the commonest argument you'll have is, I want to die in my bed, at home, without any knowledge, without any warning. I just want to go out like a light. Wouldn't that be wonderful? If you look at how actually people do die in many of our countries, and certainly in the UK, then I'm afraid that many people die in one of these two scenarios. On the left is failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a terrible way to die, with people doing cardiac massage and giving you electric shocks and sucking out your trachea and so on. Or else on the right is death in an intensive care unit with tubes coming out of every orifice, alone, abandoned in this highly technological setting. And so paradoxically, although people say they want to die at home, and so often it seems that in our very technological health services, people die very unpleasant deaths surrounded by technology. And so I think one of the real challenges as we think about it is not just to say, well, do we want euthanasia? Do we want some kind of assisted suicide? But positively, what does it mean to die well? And how, as a society, can we help people to die well and to die peace, and not with invasive and unpleasant medical equipment? I think one of the real challenges is that technological medicine has its own momentum. It tends to follow its own course, and that once you start it, it becomes harder and harder to stop. I think the real challenge for medics is and for society as a whole, is for deciding when is enough enough. At what point do we say it's time to stop and allow death to occur, rather than go on to a very technological form of dying? So now I want to come and look particularly at some of these issues from a Christian point of view. And again, I want to reiterate that I don't have any easy or slick answers, and I'm sure there aren't any. But I think a foundational principle from a Christian point of view is that Christian ethics, the way we're called to treat one another, comes fundamentally from Christian anthropology, from an understanding of what it means to be human. And one of the fascinating things about advancing technology in the field of healthcare is that it increasingly challenges this question of what does it mean to be human? How do we understand our humanity in the light of this highly advanced technology and so on? And one of the foundational principles which comes in the very first chapter of Genesis is that in the description of the creation of the world, which Michelangelo included the creation of Adam, that human beings are unique in all the entire cosmic created order, because only human beings are made in some sense as a reflection, as an image, and that only human beings, as it said, that they are made, that the God himself says, let us make human beings in our image and in our likeness. And theologians have labored long and hard to discuss precisely what this enigmatic phrase means, and there are many different traditions in discussing it. But at a most fundamental level, it seems to me what it tells us is that in Christian thinking, human beings are not self-explanatory. we derive our meaning from outside ourselves. If we are made as reflections, we are reflections of another reality, which is, in fact, of the character and being of God himself. And here's just an analogy. Suppose on the Andromeda galaxy, some super intelligent alien beings are receiving through their antenna a strange, distorted image. And you can imagine these super intelligent alien beings assessing this image. You can imagine them analyzing every single pixel, analyzing the precise frequency absorption pattern, analyzing the spatial arrangement with this very bizarre abstract image. They won't understand what they're looking at unless they understand that actually it's a map. It's the London Underground map. And actually, therefore, to use that previous phrase, this is a reflection of another reality. This precise pattern of lines and colours and its orientation is a reflection of a completely different kind of reality. These strange metallic beings which go trundling around a particular part of the planet. Infinitely less efficient, I have to say, than the Hong Kong version, which I'm very impressed about. I'm sure London could learn a lot from the Hong Kong version. But we have these ancient, you can actually see the antique underground station, which hasn't changed much for 50 years. But in other words, these two kind of beings, which appear to be so totally unrelated, have a hidden connection. One is a map, an image, a reflection of the other. Now that's just an analogy, but it seems to me that what the Orthodox Christian understanding of what it means to be human states is that the God of total power and authority, the Creator God, the God of the cosmos, chose to take a humble, pathetic carbon-based life form and use that pathetic carbon-based life form as a map, as a reflection, as an image of his own hidden character and being. And therefore you'll never understand what it means to be human unless you understand that fundamental thought, that we are not self-explanatory, that we reflect another reality completely. So in this way of thinking, human beings are not self-explanatory. The structure of our humanity, the values and the purposes of our lives only makes sense in the light of our creation as reflections of another reality. Another concept which comes from the Christian understanding of creation is that the God of authority, of total authority and creativity, not only creates a physical universe, not only makes all the physical stuff of the universe, but he impregnates this universe with a moral order. And I like to think of that as a bit like the grain that's in a wood. And in the same way, there's a hidden grain within the structure of reality which reflects the moral order. And in biblical thinking, if you live your life according to the grain, you live your life along the grain of the moral order, then by and large your life will flourish and will go well. But if you live your life across the grain, against the grain of the moral order, then by and large your life will not go well. And the Bible contrasts the wisdom literatures in the Old Testament contrast these two ways. One is the way of wisdom, to live your life along the grain, versus the way of folly, to live your life across the grain. And in this way of thinking, part of the grain, that hidden moral order, is the prohibition of intentional killing. So intentional killing of an innocent human being is wrong because it contravenes that profound moral order which lies behind the structure of the universe and which is written in our hearts. One of the interesting things to me, and rather sad things, is that there have been studies of doctors who carry out euthanasia in Holland, and perhaps it's not too surprising to discover that there seems to be a very high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, of depression, of stress, of anxiety and other mental health issues. Because the experience of killing people at the end of the needle, and the way that the doctors do it in Holland is very much like an execution. It's with an intravenous injection and the patient dies on the end of the needle. And the doctors have expressed a feeling of distaste and discomfort and unease. And of course, you could put that at a psychological level and just say, well, this is a very abnormal situation, it's not surprising. But I would interpret it at a deeper level and say that perhaps this is a reflection of the fact of that deep moral order, that when we kill one another, when we kill another human being, we feel a sense of moral unease, distaste, or much stronger than that, because it is, we are acting against the moral order of the universe. It's also very interesting that in the Bible and in all societies which have been strongly influenced by Christianity, suicide is never glorified or celebrated as a noble or honourable way to die. In many non-Christian cultures, suicide has been seen as a death of the hero, the death of the gentleman, the death of a warrior. But in all Christian cultures, suicide has never been glorified in that way. And interestingly, in the biblical narrative itself, if you think of the suicides, people like Judas Iscariot or King Saul, these are not noble, honourable deaths. These are actions of despair and hopelessness and defeat. So in Christian thinking, suicide is not seen as an honourable or a noble or a godly way to die. But interestingly, suicidal thoughts seem to be quite common in God's people. So Elijah curses the day he was born, if you remember in the story, but is then sent off on a sabbatical instead. And there are many characters who express despair and about their own lives and even suicidal thoughts. But suicide itself is not celebrated. Self-destruction is seen as a harm, not a human right to be assisted. Another foundational understanding, which again goes back to the early chapters of the Genesis narrative, are that human beings are not only made in God's image, they're also made out of dust. And in the Hebrew, the word for human, Adam, is derived from the Hebrew for ground, Adamah. So in the literal Hebrew, we are described as groundlings. And did you know the same is true in English? Apparently, human is derived from humus. Not the nice stuff you put on pita bread, but the compost heap. It's in our very name. We are made out of the stuff of the physical ground. And I think many people have seen some profound theology in that actually part of our humanity is that we share the limitation of the physical universe, and that we are designed and created to be physical, dependent, frail, and vulnerable. So dependence is not something which is an alien and a subhuman and undignified condition. It's part of the narrative of every human life. And in fact, every single one of us came into this world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And the very fact that you're sitting there looking reasonably together tells me that when you were born, somebody cared for you. Somebody kept you warm. Somebody fed you. Somebody wiped your bottom. You could do absolutely nothing. And yet, all of us come into this world utterly and totally dependent. Then we go through a phase in our lives when other people depend on us. My wife and I, we have 3 grown-up boys, and they've left home, and you think, oh, thank goodness we've just got over that phase. And then the phone rings. Dad, could you put £1,000 in my account? Dad. And I'm thinking, £1,000? So this phase, when other people depend on us, seems to go on an awful long time. But then most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And this was brought home to me in a very dramatic and painful way when my own mother was struck down with a horrible form of dementia. And in front of our eyes, she was transformed from being a vivacious, energetic lady into somebody who was utterly and totally dependent. She was confused, she was hallucinating, she was doubly incontinent, she required 24-hour nursing care. And near the end, I was visiting her, and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand, and I was saying, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth, open your mouth. And then I suddenly had a flashback. This was precisely what she used to do for me. And I could even remember her words as she was feeding me. And now the tables were turned. But I remember thinking that at the time that, this is the way it was meant to be. I was learning more of what it meant to be a son, and she was learning more of what it meant to be a mother, because dependence is part of the story. Dependence is part of the narrative. And, I think one of the great diseases of modern age are people who, I hear a lot of people say, I just don't want to be a burden to anyone. I just don't want to depend on, I'm happy to care for others, I'm happy to look after others, but I desperately don't want to be a burden. And if ever I become a burden to other people, I would much rather die than to be a burden to anyone. If you hear someone say that, or if you're tempted to say it yourself, you must immediately say, you are wrong. You are designed to be a burden to me, and I am designed to be a burden to you. And the life that we've been given is one of mutual burdensomeness. And that is such a countercultural idea, and yet arguably it's rooted into our creation from dust. It's what it means to be a fragile, vulnerable, dependent, carbon-based life form. And one of the issues which we all struggle with is, how do we think of these developing human lives? How do we think of these beings? And I think it's helpful to imagine, just imagine, this is what you look like. This is exactly what you look like. Up there on the left, that's what you look like when you were born. This is what you look like at about 28 weeks. This is what you look like at 18 weeks. Bottom left, this is what you look like at about 12 weeks. Middle, bottom, 6 weeks, 6 days. That's exactly what you look like. But interestingly, if you go back in your own personal history, is there any point at which you can say, that's not me, that's just a blob? Well, I don't think there is. I think as you go back in your own personal history, you can see the continuity of the fact that even though I was at a very early stage, it was still me. I was in the process of becoming what I already was. There is that profound continuity which we can all trace back. One of the questions which I'm often asked as somebody who's interested in the ethics of the beginning of life is, when does human life begin? And when I am asked that question, I try to respond in a gentle way as possible, but I have to say, well, I'm very sorry, that's the wrong question. Because we all agree that this being is human, and we all agree that it's alive. So the question is not, when does human life begin? The question is, when is there a person who I have a duty to protect? And the reason why it's important to frame the question properly is that when you frame the question like that, you realize it's not a scientific question. You don't find a person using an electron microscope. It's a much more profound question than that, and it's a question to do with relationality. So, Oliver O'Donovan, well-known British theologian, said, we cannot expect biology to reveal the point at which God's covenant commitment to an individual starts. We discern persons only by love, by finding each person's humanity through interaction and commitment. In other words, we discern people not by using the best kind of science, but by love. And I came across a nice example of this on the internet. So this is a very, very early ultrasound. And this little blob is 5 millimeters. If you think of what 5 millimeters look like, it's a tiny, tiny little blob of tissue. But what love sees is a baby. And so the parents are reaching out to this tiny little blob, and they see a person. They see a baby. And I think that's just an illustration of how what we are called to is a question of how are we going to treat this vulnerable human being, and what is our response to the fact that there is a being there. But then the Christian faith goes on and says something utterly bizarre and weird and mysterious. And actually, in its original format, when the Christians first started saying this, it was regarded as profoundly offensive. Because what they said and claimed was that the God of the universe, the God of supreme power and authority, had chosen to turn himself into one of these pathetic carbon-based life forms, and that God himself somehow invades the womb and becomes one of these strange kinds of beings. And so, in the Christian faith asked itself, what does God in human form actually look like? Wouldn't it be amazing to have been 2 millennia ago in Galilee and seen what God in human form looks like? Well, I can tell you what God in human form looks like. It looks like that. And if you think about it, that is utterly bizarre and strange and weird. But that's what the Christian faith claims, that God entered into our humanity from the inside, and he experienced it. And he was born as a baby. He, the God of total power and authority, turns himself into a pathetic, squealing, squirming baby who needs to be fed and kept clean and washed and have his bottom wiped. And I think we're so familiar with the Christmas story that we've lost how utterly scandalous and bizarre it is that the God of the universe turns himself into a baby who needs to have his bottom wiped. I mean, that is just disgusting. And yet that's what the Christian faith says. And at the end of his life, the God of total power and authority stretched out on a cross with his arms outstretched, and the God of total power through parched lips says, I am thirsty. And he can do nothing for himself. He has made himself utterly and totally dependent. So, in this mysterious way, it is our humanity which reveals God. So, in Christian thinking, our humanity is not a barrier which comes between us and God. It's the very means by which God is revealed. So, how does that flesh itself out? Well, I would argue, and of course, many of these things are highly controversial, and they're controversial among Christians. I don't want to claim in any way that my own conclusions are the same as necessarily what other Christian believers. But my own conclusions are these, that every human life is precious because this is the form in which God became flesh, because there is something unique about human flesh. It is more than simply a carbon-based life form. It is an image. It has some profound significance. When the early church fathers were trying to find words which would express the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, they came up with the phrase, which is in the Nicene Creed, that God was, in the Old English, begotten, not made, that he was given birth to, not created. And that distinction represents a very profound distinction. That which we give birth to, which we beget, comes as a gift from our being, whereas that which we create comes from our will and is therefore ours to mold and control. And the idea that when we give birth to a being, that being is in some strange way equal to us in dignity. So we care for and nurture and educate our children, but we don't control them or manipulate them. They are in some sense equal to us. I think one of the risks of reproductive technology is that we start to see our children as a product of our will, as a creation, rather than a gift from our being. That doesn't mean that reproductive technology is wrong, but it does mean that it carries within it that inherent tendency of regarding our children as a product. I also want to argue that dependence and fragility and vulnerability, to use a philosophical term, contingency, which means we are vulnerable to chance events, all of these are part of the creation design for human beings, that in some bizarre way and strange and wonderful way, this is the way we are meant to be. And therefore, to try to overcome our dependence, to make ourselves masters, to give total autonomy, is in some way to dehumanize ourselves, paradoxically, because it's in dependence that we discover what it really means to be human. That's not to say that dependence is easy. I've given talks like this many times and talked about dependence, and then a couple of years ago I fell over and fractured my ankle, and I found myself in a wheelchair, desperately clawing up the stairs of our home, our Victorian house, to try and get to the loo. It took me about 15 minutes of agonized crawling to get me to the loo. And then we were going out on the streets of London, and my idiot son was pushing me in a wheelchair with gay abandon across these busy roads. And I was saying, "Be careful, be careful, be careful." And he's, "Don't worry, Dad, it's all fine." So I remember thinking at the time, this dependence stuff is vastly overrated. So I don't want to say it's easy. I don't think it is easy. I think to discover that we depend on others and that we need others to care for us can be profoundly challenging and difficult. But I do believe it's part of our humanity. I believe it's part of the way we are made. And that, yes, we do want to help people to be as independent as possible, but fundamentally, dependence is not dehumanizing and it is not undignified. And the Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatian church, said, "Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." And sometimes, it is in the most fragile and the most vulnerable and the most dependent that we see of human beings, that we see something very wonderful and very profound. Verity on the left is a very good friend of Celia, my wife, and I, and she was having her first child, and she and her husband were overjoyed with the news that she was pregnant, and they were really looking forward to having the child. And then it turned out that the child had trisomy 18, which is Edwards syndrome, a very severe genetic disorder which is nearly always fatal, and children will often die in the first few hours or days of life, and occasionally will live for longer. And in this situation, most doctors would strongly recommend an abortion, because they would say, what possible reason would there be to carry on through the pregnancy when you know the baby's going to die? Why would you put yourself through it? Why would you put your child through it if you know they're going to die? Surely the compassionate, the loving thing to do is to have an abortion. But Alan and Verity really wrestled with this, but they felt, this is the baby that we've been given, and this is the baby we will love and celebrate. And little baby Christopher was born, and he only weighed a couple of pounds. And he had all the signs of Edwards syndrome. He had quite severe abnormalities of the brain and the heart and other internal organs. But to everyone's surprise, he didn't die straight away, and they were able to bring him home. And they used to bring him along to the church, All Souls Church in central London, where I go with my family. And he became like a mini celebrity. So he was the smallest member of the church family, but everybody wanted to have a cuddle. And he used to get passed from arm to arm, and everybody knew about little baby Christopher. And he lived for several months, and then he got weaker and weaker, and he died peacefully at home with his parents. And a memorial service was held in the church, and over 400 people turned up to pay tribute to little baby Christopher. He was still weighed about the same, a few pounds when he died as when he was born. But one of Alan and Verity's friends said, Christopher couldn't grow, but he helped other people to grow. And it was true that in his own way, Christopher too was a godlike being, a wonderful but fragile and frail and malformed but wonderful being. He touched many lives. And so, again, there's this strange paradox that it isn't necessarily the Olympic athlete, the Nobel Prize winner, the national business person, the politicians. It isn't necessarily the strongest of human beings who most reveal what is profound about humanity. It's sometimes the weakest and the most vulnerable. And I like this definition from Joseph Piper, who's a philosopher who argued that love is a way of saying to a person, it's good that you're alive, it's good that you exist, it's good that you're in the world. And you see, the problem with suicide and euthanasia, and also I believe in many forms of abortion, is it says it's bad that you exist. It'd be much better for the world if you didn't exist. But I would argue that true love always says, no, it's good that you exist, and it's good that you're in the world, and we will love you and support you. It doesn't mean we will give every possible medical treatment that's available, that's another question, but our fundamental orientation is to say, it's good that you exist. One of the remarkable responses to euthanasia and suicide in the UK was the development of palliative care. And this lady, Cicely Saunders, was a pioneer. She was a doctor who was strongly influenced by the Christian faith, and she developed a completely new way of caring for dying people. And she realized that actually the process of dying could be a very profoundly positive experience. And so this was one of her quotes: "You matter because you are you. You matter to the end of your life. Not only will we help you to die well, we'll help you to live before you die." And that phrase, to live before you die, became one of the phrases of the movement, helping people to make the most of those last few days. And so the goal of palliative care was neither to try to hasten death, to try to kill people and shuffle them off as rapidly as possible, nor was it to try and prolong life as long as possible. The goal of palliative care was to allow death to occur by natural means, but to use the very best medical and psychological and relational support and spiritual support to help people to die well, to help people to make the most of whatever hours and days and weeks they had. And another quote which came out of that movement, which means a lot to me, is this one: "Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence." I think sometimes, and I speak here to Christian people, is that sometimes Christian people are so concerned with trying to come up with explanations and theological answers as to why suffering occurs. But actually that's not the answer. It's not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery. But what we are called, all of us, are to be the presence. We're called to be there with people who are suffering and to show them genuine compassion and care. And so I close with this. One of the most profound issues is how we as human beings think of suffering. I come from University College London, and as you may or may not know, UCL was founded by Jeremy Bentham, a utilitarian philosopher. He was really the father of utilitarianism. In utilitarianism, pain and suffering is regarded as the ultimate moral evil. Pain is something that is utterly evil and to be avoided at all costs. So the whole essence of utilitarianism is to maximize positive emotions, pleasure, and minimize pain and suffering. And that kind of philosophy is something that is becoming extremely common, and it seems to make common sense that, of course, we want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. But Christianity has a much more nuanced and profound understanding. Of course, Christianity was foundational in the development of modern medicine, and so the whole medical development of painkillers and of treatment for people who are suffering, Christianity has driven that. So Christianity is not some kind of masochism that celebrates pain and suffering in some unhealthy way. But the very story, the Christian story, which is the story of the cross, is a story where evil, inexplicable evil, is turned into strange blessing and healing. And that story of the cross, it seems to me, is a story that can be repeated in all our human lives. So all of us meet inexplicable and terrible suffering. I can guarantee to you, I'm sorry to say that to you, some of the young people here in the start of your lives, at some point in your life you are going to meet inexplicable and terrible suffering and evil and horror and loss. But what the Christian message has to say is that evil and loss is not the end of the story, that actually God's plan for this age is not to abolish human suffering, it is to redeem it, it is in some mysterious way to bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. And for what it's worth, that is my own story, my own life that I can see repeated, and it's something that I've been able to see in some of my patients and those who I have the privilege of caring for. Well, thanks so much for listening. That's really the end of what I've got to say, but I'm delighted to respond to any questions.